Welcome back. Everybody sufficiently caffeinated, networked, stimulated? Well, we have further stimulation and great insights for you for the rest of the day. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. Susan McDonald is President and CEO of NAXION, previously known as National Analyst. Susan is a marketing consultant and a veteran market researcher and has been with Booz Allen and Hamilton, where she was partner and vice president. Her career really spans a broad range of categories, industries, from consumer products like Coke to pharmaceuticals like Viagra. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Viagra, yes, okay. Look, her work has focused primarily on launch and lifecycle management, forecasting, positioning, portfolio strategy, market segmentation. She's an expert in pharma, DTC, and understanding what she will be talking about today as the rough road from consumer to loyal patient. And she's well-versed in that she has both a master's and a PhD from the Annenberg School at University of Pennsylvania, and she began as a journalist and a poet, and is in the process of writing 2 books. And I think the comment was, not even the greatest predictive forecasting can predict which one will be finished first. Correct? So it's my great pleasure to welcome Susan McDonald to the stage. Susan.
Good morning. It's still morning. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be back in the Twin Cities. I sound like a smarmy lounge singer when I say that. I'm not trying to curry audience favor. I love Minneapolis. I spent a lot of my youth, my young professional time here, commuting back and forth to Philadelphia, actually, sometimes on a weekly basis, and scurrying around the Twin Cities area, from clients like Medtronic to General Mills to Land O'Lakes to St. Jude's. And that particular eclectic experience really positioned me very well to do what I do today. I gave Chris a lot of adjectives, and it comes straight from my bio. You have to be able to pivot when you're trying to sell marketing consulting services. But really, to describe the way I spend most of my time today really requires that you understand that, like patients that might be born into the United plan and then exit as centennials, drugs have the same kind of life cycle. And my job, given my involvement with all of the stakeholders, and by the way, I spent a lot of time trying to convince plans like United Healthcare to provide access to my clients' drugs. But my responsibility is really to take those drugs from a kind of in utero position, often when they are molecules whose proof of concept is still to be established, and walk them through the commercialization process so that when they are born, they're born with the strongest possible label. They can make the most claims, the most persuasive claims. We are actually almost writing our ad copy as we develop our FDA submissions. Actually, even further back, we are thinking about how to position those compounds, what to do with them, and then as they enter their maturity, we actually have to do what we can to extend their life and their health until patent expiration, which is a very different process from consumer products, which in a sense have an ill-defined life cycle. So one of the things that I just want to comment today is that this is probably one of the first talks that I've given in a long time in which I did not actually have to use the word millennial. And that's because when you're talking about direct-to-consumer advertising, which is what I'm going to focus on today, there really is no need to talk about millennials. Very little of what we advertise is appropriate for people who are younger than 40. Not everything, but usually 40 is the cutoff, because that's when chronic illness begins, chronic diagnoses. And that's the point at which the ROI on direct-to-consumer advertising begins to evolve and ripen, as it were. So the only other thing I'll say before I go to my slides, and by the way, now that you've seen my dress, I'm going to probably have to go back to the podium because I'm so vain, and I don't have 20/20 vision, so I really can't see any notes on the screen that everybody else has used, so I'm just going to have to go back to my podium. But the thing that I want to point out is that for those of you who are in the business of advertising almost everything else, you can look at me and my clients as there but for the grace of God, because the constraints that we experience are, from a creative to a regulatory perspective, extremely inhibiting. So I have to be two-fisted with this now. It's a very constrained environment today, but it wasn't always so. By the way, I can't say for sure whether either of these products was ad tested by the company that was the progenitor of the firm that I now lead, but it is the world's first advertising research firm. It grew up as part of Curtis Publishing Company in 1911. And so ads just like this were tested in the very first market research laboratory or advertising research laboratory ever. Clearly, heroin is a product that really doesn't require advertising. Once you acquire a customer, he or she is yours for life. For those of you who occasionally drink sassafras tea, sassafras is not, I will reassure you, addictive. On the other hand, it's entirely unproven, entirely untested, used for things ranging from kidney stones to venereal disease to any old thing that you want, with dubious benefits in almost every respect, although it may do something. It is no longer in mass-produced food, but it was the basis for root beer and sarsaparilla, just saying. So prescription drugs and insurance, quite apropos, are products really no one wants to buy. And Terry earlier referenced the use of humor in insurance. Pharmaceuticals don't really have so much license to be funny. It's serious disease. FDA regulates it. There are only so many jokes you can tell about, and no one means to be funny in Cialis and Viagra ads, although they may be comic. But the truth is that of all of the categories out there, probably the two that people least want to buy are prescription drugs and insurance. And it's because we're selling another kind of dependence. Really, if you think about prescription drugs, it's an unwelcome solution to a bad problem. It took pharma decades to recognize that. The CEOs of pharmaceutical companies up until maybe the late 90s thought, why don't they want us? Why don't they want our drugs? You know, we're such good guys. We do all this great stuff. We're keeping people alive. We're keeping them healthier. And people just don't want that kind of drug bondage. Most consumers actually would prefer to adjudicate their own risk benefits. And even when it's based on no information or bad information, which is why some people are still drinking sassafras tea, they feel that they're in control. They don't want to relinquish control to a trained intermediary like a physician. Much is made, and I've already taken you down that path, about the difference between DTC advertising and advertising everything else. And certainly the creative handcuffs are very real. However, the buying process is fundamentally the same. The same kinds of questions have to be asked and answered in order to activate a consumer and encourage him or her to do what is the call to action for all DTC advertising, and that is ultimately to ask your doctor. And these are still the basics for everything that is advertised. But pharma does have unique challenges, and it isn't just the regulatory handcuffs on creative, which we'll talk about later. You have the challenge of encouraging people to accept that they have a condition, or even to understand that they have a condition. You have denial, people who don't want to believe that they need to manage that condition. The fact that consumers are themselves disempowered not only by their emotions, but by the lack of information. The internet is full of data and facts, but the interpretation of those facts, the weighting of those facts, the application of those facts to one's own individual life circumstance and condition requires a trained user. It is really not for amateurs. I mentioned the stilted messaging, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. There are medical barriers, of course. Not only does the physician have to prescribe and the health insurer have to approve and pay, but also, once you get a consumer to the doctor's office, he or she may not be an eligible candidate for the drug that's been advertised for a variety of reasons. And then there is the problem of tenuous loyalty. Pharmaceutical patients, customers, are some of the most disloyal in the world. They can't wait to slip out of their chains. They're naughty, they're mischievous. They are always looking to slip out of therapy. Most of the acquisition leverage actually is with physicians. So that's where most marketing is spent. Physician marketing accounts for something like 7/8. If you can figure it out, it's a little opaque, of the $30+ billion in marketing that's spent every year. And by the way, urban legends, R&D accounts for twice the spending of drug marketing. It's not the case that more is spent on drug marketing than R&D. As someone who literally goes with products from their very early molecular stages to the end of their life cycle, I can tell you that for a fact. But the patient is really more in charge of retention in the end, and that's a critical aspect of DTC as well. So there are some basic stats that are worth knowing. DTC is very much a unicorn, rare sighting. Most countries in the world do not want the pharmaceutical industry talking to the end users. And I noted with wry pleasure the leitmotif of this morning that is reminding people about the relevance of TV advertising and broadcasting. The pharmaceutical industry is still very much committed to broadcast advertising for a variety of reasons. Right now, though, the Willie Sutton principle is the most compelling of all. That's where the patients are. That's where the older folks are. And other ad categories, as you know, are shrinking on television, at least marginally. By the way, it is extremely expensive to advertise, and as much as you may think drugs are high-profit items, there's no meaningful campaign for less than $80 million, and many drugs do not justify $80 million worth of DTC ad spending, and that's because there's lots of other things you have to do. You still need squadrons of sales reps going into physicians' offices and tons of med ed and all kinds of other things. There is a slow shift to digital, cross-platform. Everybody's thinking about it right now. The conventional wisdom, I think, for many agencies, unless they're purely digital, is that it's not as good a return on the investment, but it's something everyone has to be prepared for. One of the problems is we don't really understand very well what to do with the web because most searches are actually not about drugs. Most searches are about symptoms. So typically what happens is that patients go to the web after they've had a drug discussion with their physician and not before. Fair Balance, this thing many of you have heard of, takes the brand promise and absolutely mutes it. There's so much the FDA won't let you say. You can't say things like new and improved. You can't say better than ever. You can't say anything will work. You can't even say try it. Really what you're doing is telling people something may be useful for them. If they have a particular set of trigger conditions, go to your doctor. And by the way, cross-platform, because the FDA requires that you be able to see more information. When you see for Viagra or Cialis, the see our ad in Golf Digest magazine or something like that, it's because there's more print there. So that's actually why regulatory policy requires cross-platform use. I can't imagine, but just show of hands, everybody in this room seen an ad for Humira or Enbrel, which is another biologic? Show of hands. Okay, well, Humira is probably the single most advertised brand in the world. It is a truly great drug. It's a blockbuster worldwide. It belongs to a family of drugs called Biologics, which use monoclonal antibodies to mimic or block natural biological processes. They all have in common that they are injected because they are big molecules, not small. And AbbVie, the company that markets Humira and that developed it, is probably going to spend $250 million on DTC this year. Now, you can see, and my husband asks me this all the time, are you serious? Do your clients actually get anything out of this? All I hear is the stuff these things do to kill you. And I specifically, I don't expect anyone to read it, but you've all heard it. Humira can actually cause cancer. It can cause TB. It can cause, or by virtue of the fact that it suppresses your immune system, it can reduce your body's ability to resist infection. What it does do, though, is interrupt inflammatory processes that cause everything from rheumatoid arthritis to psoriatic arthritis to psoriasis to Crohn's disease, and it's very effective. And its biological cousins are all very effective. This ad broke the paradigm, which said you can't really advertise drugs that are so difficult to talk about on television, and indeed you can. Humira has had, I think, a very big ROI on its investment. And one of the things that biologic advertising has done, and it is one of the big categories, is it has helped the dialogue between physicians and patients because it actually brings some additional information to patients and enables them to feel more comfortable talking to physicians and vice versa. And by the way, the semiotics of these ads are very similar to the semiotics that all other ads use, even though you can't make jokes. You can have cartoon people, maybe. You can have cute little fake animals like Belsomra, which is just one of the most wonderful commercials. I don't know that if anyone is in here that... I'm glad to give you a plug, Belle, but it's a fabulous, fabulous ad, and one of the best DTC ads I've ever seen. I don't have it to play because it's really not part of my points, but what these ads do, of course, is while talking it seriously about serious things, they do show people who are restored to functionality. And the Humira dad, who is building a dollhouse with his child, is able to participate in life and important things that matter, to engage, socialize, be relevant, be effective in ways that he wouldn't otherwise be able to do. These are the key assumptions behind DTC. And they all reflect a fundamental healthcare paradigm that is democracy, propelled really by two things: the flow of information and the shift in cost to patients. Patients really are now a critical piece of the value proposition assessment. And even though, of course, most drug cost burden is shouldered by organizations like United Healthcare, the patients are paying an increasing part. And that's another reason why DTC advertising is becoming more and more important in the overall calculus. And as I mentioned, what DTC advertising does is it really does make it easier for physicians to introduce costly conversations to patients. So are these assumptions correct? Well, you have to look at several different stakeholders in this process. It's certainly true that there are some patients who do want to be more in charge. At any given time, we believe that 1 in 4 may be shopping for a new drug. By that, we mean that they're not satisfied, they have side effects, it's not working, what they're on doesn't work very well, or maybe they're on nothing at all. There is here, I think, even less understanding in this realm of the ROI than there might have been in various areas of more mainstream advertising. There are academic researchers who would argue that 1 in 3 patients will respond to a DTC ad. Our data in my firm, and we do a lot of ROI work, does not support that. It's much more like 1 in 5 patients have ever responded to a DTC promotion, and the majority of those patients will get an offer. the majority of them will accept. Our estimates are that net 1 in 10 exposed patients will leave the office with a prescription. But the rhythm and the time frames are very, very different from the ones that Dave described, because patients don't rush to the doctor. They wait until their next visit. So you're really talking about an ROI that's calculated over the course of perhaps a year. And you know, all told, this is actually not a bad activation rate. Physicians themselves are generally, I would say, disgruntled but resigned to DTC advertising. We just did in my firm a survey for our own interest to update our understanding of how physicians felt about direct-to-consumer advertising. What occasioned it was the fact that the AMA recently denounced DTC advertising. The truth is that no one cares what the AMA says, and physicians certainly don't, but a slight majority of them think DTC has more negative effects than positive. However, a month after the AMA announced it, most physicians didn't even know that they announced it, so it made no difference. One thing that we did learn, though, that is interesting and hard to act on is physicians who approve of direct-to-consumer advertising are more likely to recall being asked for a drug, and they're also more likely to grant a request. So getting physicians to buy into DTC advertising is actually part of the process. The FDA is an interesting party in this, because you would imagine that the FDA objects to DTC. And at one time, they were grudging as well. But the FDA is actually on board, and they're now investing a lot of money to try to understand how to improve the flow of information to consumers, recognizing that DTC is here to stay, at least in the United States. So what they need to do is to really understand whether too much of that, quote, brief summary or fair balance is actually numbing to patients. Patients do actually learn to listen past it, and they often, I think, diminish, because we've talked to many of them, they often tend to think that because all of that language is coming fast and it's technical, it's complex, it's unlikely to be a real problem for them. So they think around it. And the FDA is actually beginning to think that less could be more, that the less said, perhaps, the better, so long as certain obligations are met and patients and due diligence is performed. So there is ongoing research there. We've been working with companies, pharma companies in the industry, to gain data not for their own purposes, but actually to be able to have an informed perspective, much as ARF does, to be able to deliver impartial, research-based, fact-based insights on how this process works and what can really optimize it. So you probably, many of you, heard the term patient journey, and if you haven't, it is the idiom du jour of the pharmaceutical industry. Hint to advertising agencies and anyone out there engaged in this, it's actually a term patients don't love when they hear it. It's diminutizing. Journeys are things that come out of fairy tales. They're not real people, and they seem somehow as if they're going on some fantasy place. Patients are living a real-life problem when they are diagnosed with diabetes or with Crohn's or with MS, and they have a process that takes them through points of inflection, disease exacerbations, remissions, and many times simply exacerbation. And that process, which is referred to the journey, means that at some points along the way, patients will be more or less susceptible, more or less in need of changes in drug therapy. And the goal of the industry is to try to reach them at those moments that matter, to first develop the market through diagnosis, because many patients don't know they're sick, and then to ultimately accelerate and capture relevant switches for patients who are not optimally treated. One thing I'll tell you, and it was interesting to hear Dave speak, I've been involved in DTC since its very inception. I'm that old. And one of the first things that I did was build a model for CVS, because CVS was trying to market DTC advertising as a concept to pharmaceutical clients. And by model here, I don't mean a quantitative one, but really to try to understand what pharmaceutical products lend themselves well, which could deliver an ROI. And you may wonder, maybe you haven't, why hypertension, which is one of the most common diagnoses in the United States, never is associated with direct-to-consumer advertising. And the reason for that, even though the epidemiology is very supportive of it, is that in fact, many of the drugs are interchangeable, but where they are not, physicians really need to customize them to particular physiologies and disease processes that patients have, meaning that the ROI is simply not there. Any of you have ever heard, though, direct-to-consumer advertising by Vanda on non-24, which is a condition of blind people who have trouble staying awake during the day because their circadian rhythms are really altered by darkness. I'm wondering what Vanda is doing there. I can't figure it out. So sometimes DTC is a vanity thing. You advertise to your stockholders sometimes. I'm lucky that I don't think there are any pharmaceutical companies here, so I'm safe. So the moment really and the message are critical. You want to target proactive patients who are relevant to your condition. How do you do it? The pharmaceutical industry has always had packaged goods envy. They have always wanted to use segmentation. Those of you in the audience who are skilled users of segmentation, and many of you who are missionary users of segmentation, would have to acknowledge it has its ups and downs, its good days and its bad. It's a delicate art, and the pharmaceutical industry has really struggled to use it well for a lot of reasons. And many psychographic segmentations of patients, I believe, are unproductive. We have what I refer to as a segmentation hospital. In our clinic, we have to do a lot of rehabilitation and to simplify what people are doing. Because the truth is, you can have frustrated adherents and earnest, proactive social self-actualizers and passive, isolated deniers. And at the end of the day, whether they are willing to take your drug or not often cuts across those psychographic labels. And it turns out that proactive patients, the ones you are most likely to engage with DTC, aren't always dissatisfied. So what we argue to our clients, first of all, is acknowledge your creative handcuffs. Ultimately, the drug science defines promotable benefits. What the drug does has to be said. How well it works, meaning some patients have had benefit. That's what you can say. And the drug labels really create prescriptive segmentation frameworks. So if you hear, there are a lot of psoriasis ads on television, and they all say my moderate to severe psoriasis. Awkward, but it has to be said, lest anyone imagine that if they have mild psoriasis, they are candidates for these biologic problems. So boy, is this a there but for the grace of God moment for the rest of you when you think about all the things that we can't do with these ads? So what we tell our clients is, look, there are a couple of, you may not need psychographic segmentation the way you think of it. There are a couple of key activation potential criteria. Patients, you need to talk to patients who want at least some responsibility, but they have to be believers in RX drug therapy. The person who is the renegade, the person who only wants to use sassafras tea and alternative medicines and homeopathic remedies, that's not really your primary audience. And by the way, in addition to being dissatisfied or in need, they have to have a rapport with their physician. If they are true renegades, if they don't interact well with their physicians, there is no dialogue to be started. We've seen that. Patients who don't have a good relationship with their physician will not respond to DTC. So we need people who are empowered but not rogues. I don't know if I probably don't have time to play the Linzess commercial for you, but this is actually an interesting example. Chronic constipation is probably the single most benign diagnosis in the United States. And there are many people who have it all the time. And yet most of them do not want to take an RX drug. It's just a symptom, it's not a disease, and patients really resist it. Now Linzess, an Allergan product, is spending quite a lot of money to do what none of my clients before have been willing to do, which is to advertise and hope that they can persuade some patients to relinquish some of their control to a physician and have the physician write the prescription. And I think if I have any time at the end, I'll be glad to play it, but I won't play it now. The problem with DTC, especially for a category like constipation, is that half may not fill any RX. So when we talk about the leaky bucket that has to be scaled, patients may never go to the pharmacy at all. If they do, they may be turned away because payers will provide resistance. Many will fill once and never fill again, and not because of side effects either. Long-term compliance is variable, but even for those who persist, we estimate that no more than 2/3 of prescribed pills are actually taken. This is not a great business model, actually. So for those of you who are thinking that you wish that you were selling constipation pills instead of gluten-free Cheerios, you might be wrong. But constipation is particularly difficult because patients really object to the idea of chronic therapy for something that they think they ought to control, and everyone wants to be the boss of their own bowels, I'm just saying. And physicians will not press compliance. They will not, because there's no reason to. Who cares? I mean, it's all in the eye of the beholder and the GI tract of the patient. So what's critical for all products that are spending a minimum of $80 million and upwards of $200 million a year, or any kind of marketing, is to really focus on DTP as well as DTC, because customer retention is every bit as important as customer acquisition. Inertia is really not a marketing strategy, and you cannot count on an automatic annuity. Until recently, all pharma was doing was to try to mitigate access problems by and reducing financial burden. Patients really need to be personally engaged on the other side of the bucket. They need water wings. So when we describe a transition from a shout to a whisper, this is a really different kind of process, because DTC is talking to everyone in one way or another and hoping that the relevant patients will hear and be activated. DTP is a conversation that can be had between a brand and a patient, and it can be highly customized, and you can communicate through the patient's preferred medium at a preferred frequency, using messages that reflect individual concerns, as long as you enroll patients in these programs. And here you have the ability to create dynamic segmentations that follow patients and in a highly mass customized way to really engage with them so that you provide support. We talk in our industry now about beyond the pill, and that involves taking ownership of outcomes. This is a code for solutions, and I'm sure people at United Healthcare are very much aware of it. The emerging model requires a change in the sight line from pill-centric to patient-centric. We've heard about patient centricity. From the pharma perspective, pill centricity has been damaging. And this means everything from biomarkers that really help patients to identify, or physicians to identify, drugs that will succeed, and patients who as well support programs for diabetes and other kinds of things. So beyond the pill is CRM, because patients are customers. Who knew? And it means leveraging IT in promoting health, branding your results, restoring pharma credibility and prestige by really following patients through to actual outcomes and creating a connection that is more durable than just the first RX. The one comment I'll make, and I know that we have to go, the pharma industry is trying now to demonstrate value by creating this sort of DTP brand program solutions. It's my personal opinion, and I would state it if there were pharma clients or companies in the audience, that the organizations that are really best positioned to support patients beyond the pill with healthcare solutions are organizations like United Healthcare. They have the sightline, they have the data, they have the permission to enter patients' lives in ways that pharma does not. And for the moment, pharma needs to do it in order to walk the halls and talk the talk with managed care and with patients. But the reality is the future, I think, belongs to payers and healthcare providers and integrated networks that can really see the 360 patient and control delivery of healthcare. So I'm just going to leave you with this cartoon, and if anybody is interested at all, it's hard to read. It's hard to read. She thinks she's so great because she has real celiac disease. I am working on the first drug for celiac disease, and if anybody wants to hear what's going to happen with that and the challenges of disambiguating this ridiculous faux celiac problem that everybody wants to take on, sorry for the, Cheerios comment, and it's a way to make a living, I know, and the real celiac disease, which is no kidding causes cancer, that would be it. Thank you all very, very much. Sorry to overstay my welcome, and see you later.